a nation ignited. The Syrian uprising of 2011. The year 2011 marked a period of profound change in the Arab world. It was the year of the Arab Spring, a wave of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across North Africa and the Middle East. In Syria, a nation ruled by the iron fist of the Assad regime for over 4 decades, the winds of change blew with particular ferocity. Inspired by the events unfolding in Tunisia and Egypt, Syrian citizens took to the streets in March 2011, demanding political reforms and an end to corruption. The protests, initially peaceful, were met with a brutal crackdown by the Syrian government. Security forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing dozens and injuring countless others. The government's heavy-handed response only served to further enrage the population, pushing the country towards the precipice of a full-blown civil war. Defectors from the Syrian army, disillusioned with the brutality they were ordered to inflict upon their own people, joined the ranks of the opposition, forming the Free Syrian Army (FSA). Shifting sands, the rise of armed opposition. The Syrian civil war, which began as a popular uprising against an authoritarian regime, soon became a complex and multifaceted conflict. The Free Syrian Army, initially the main armed opposition group, fragmented into a multitude of smaller militias, each with its own agenda and allegiances. Adding to the complexity of the conflict was the emergence of extremist groups, some of which had ties to Al-Qaeda. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, a particularly brutal and well-organized jihadist group, emerged as a major player in the conflict, seizing vast swaths of territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq. The rise of ISIS presented a dilemma for the international community. Some countries, including the United States, provided support to moderate rebel groups fighting against both the Assad regime and ISIS. Others, like Russia and Iran, remained steadfast allies of the Syrian government, viewing its survival as paramount in the fight against terrorism. The shadow of extremism, ISIS and the global jihadist movement. The Syrian civil war provided fertile ground for the growth of extremist groups like ISIS. ISIS offered a sense of belonging, purpose and power, attracting recruits from across the Middle East and beyond. The group's success in establishing a self-proclaimed caliphate in parts of Syria and Iraq sent shockwaves through the world. Its brutal tactics, including beheadings, crucifixions and sexual enslavement, were broadcast on social media, spreading terror and revulsion. The group's online propaganda machine proved to be highly effective in recruiting new members and inspiring attacks around the globe. The United States, leading a coalition of international partners, launched airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq, while also providing support to local forces fighting the group on the ground. While these efforts succeeded in degrading ISIS's capabilities and eventually driving it from its territorial holdings, the group's ideology continued to pose a threat, inspiring attacks in the West and fueling instability in the Middle East. A region divided, proxy wars and international intervention. The Syrian civil war was not simply an internal conflict. It became a proxy war, a battleground for regional and international powers vying for influence. Iran, viewing the Assad regime as a crucial ally in its regional power struggle with Saudi Arabia, provided significant military and financial support to the Syrian government. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia group backed by Iran, also sent fighters to bolster Assad's forces. On the other side of the conflict, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar provided support to various rebel groups fighting against the Assad regime. Russia's intervention in 2015, launching airstrikes in support of the Syrian government, marked a turning point in the conflict, tipping the balance of power in favor of Assad and his allies. The involvement of multiple external actors with conflicting interests made the Syrian civil war even more complex and intractable. Peace talks, mediated by the United Nations, made little progress as the various parties remained entrenched in their positions. Section 5. The Fall of Aleppo. A turning point in the Syrian war. The Battle of Aleppo, which raged for over 4 years, became a microcosm of the Syrian civil war's brutality and complexity. The city, once Syria's largest and a thriving commercial center, was divided between government forces in the west and rebel groups in the east. In December 2016, after months of intense fighting, Syrian government forces, backed by Russian air power and Iranian-backed militias, captured the rebel-held eastern part of Aleppo. The fall of Aleppo marked a major turning point in the war, solidifying the Assad regime's control over Syria's major cities and dealing a severe blow to the armed opposition. The capture of Aleppo came at a heavy cost. The city, once a symbol of Syrian culture and history, was reduced to rubble. Thousands of civilians were killed and countless others were displaced, fleeing to other parts of Syria or seeking refuge in neighboring countries. Section 6. Assad's grip tightens. Reclaiming territory, crushing dissent. With the fall of Aleppo, the momentum of the war shifted decisively in favor of the Assad regime. Backed by Russia and Iran, Syrian government forces went on the offensive, recapturing territory from rebel groups across the country. By 2018, the Syrian government had regained control of most of Syria's major cities and population centers. Rebel groups, though weakened, continued to control pockets of territory, particularly in Idlib province in northwestern Syria. Turkey, seeking to prevent a further influx of Syrian refugees and to limit the influence of Kurdish groups in northern Syria, launched military operations in the country, further complicating the conflict. Despite the Assad regime's military successes, the country remained deeply divided. The war's legacy of violence, displacement and destruction made it difficult to envision a future for Syria in which all its citizens could live together in peace. Section 7. The ruins of a nation humanitarian crisis and displacement. The Syrian civil war triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history. Millions of Syrians were displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries or becoming internally displaced persons within Syria. The war's devastating impact on the country's infrastructure and economy exacerbated the humanitarian crisis, leaving millions without access to basic necessities like food, water, and medical care. The international community, struggling to cope with the scale of the crisis, provided billions of dollars in humanitarian aid to Syria. However, the aid effort was hampered by the conflict's complexity, the difficulty of accessing besieged areas, and the Assad regime's restrictions on aid delivery. The Syrian refugee crisis also had a profound impact on neighboring countries, particularly Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, which bore the brunt of the exodus. The influx of refugees strained these countries' resources and infrastructure, fueling social tensions and raising concerns about security. Section 8. Justice and accountability. The quest for peace and reconciliation. As the Syrian civil war dragged on, calls for justice and accountability grew louder. Human rights groups documented widespread atrocities committed by all sides in the conflict, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Assad regime in particular was accused of systematic and widespread human rights violations, including the use of chemical weapons against its own people. The international community, divided on how to respond to the atrocities committed in Syria, struggled to hold perpetrators accountable. The quest for justice and accountability in Syria faced formidable challenges. The Syrian people, who had endured unimaginable suffering, were left to grapple with the trauma of war and the long and arduous process of rebuilding their shattered lives and communities. Section 9. Syria's uncertain future, challenges and opportunities. As of late 2024, the Syrian civil war has entered its second decade. While the intensity of the fighting has decreased, the conflict is far from over. The country remains fragmented, with the Assad regime in control of most of the territory, but with rebel groups, Kurdish forces and Turkish-backed militias holding onto pockets of land. The war's devastating impact on Syria's economy, infrastructure and social fabric will take generations to overcome. The future of Syria remains uncertain. The return of millions of refugees and internally displaced persons presents a daunting task, as does the need to address the root causes of the conflict, including political repression, corruption, and sectarian tensions. Despite the immense challenges, there are also glimmers of hope for Syria's future. The resilience of the Syrian people, their determination to rebuild their lives, and their yearning for peace provide a foundation for a better future.